Anti-Semitism is rising again. That statement makes many people uncomfortable because after the Holocaust, there was a widespread belief that humanity had already learned this lesson. Many assumed anti-Semitism would survive only on the fringes, in extremist groups and obscure conspiracy circles. But that is not what we are seeing. Jewish communities around the world are reporting more threats, more vandalism, more harassment, more intimidation, and in some cases, more violence. Jewish schools and synagogues are increasing security. Jewish students on college campuses are describing an atmosphere that often feels openly hostile. And online, old narratives are spreading with a speed that would have been impossible in another era. So we have to ask a deeper question. Why now? Why again? To answer that, we have to examine more than one layer. We have to look at the reality of the rise itself. We have to understand how these narratives spread in the digital age. We have to understand why propaganda works so effectively on human beings. We have to look at how Jews have been scapegoated across centuries. We have to examine why Jewish communities, though not the only scapegoat in history, have been particularly vulnerable to this pattern. And then we have to ask why these old ideas are finding such fertile ground again right now. Let's begin with the information environment. In earlier centuries, propaganda moved at the speed of institutions. It traveled through sermons, pamphlets, newspapers, speeches, rumors, and word of mouth. It could still be dangerous, but it moved relatively slowly. Today, that is no longer true. A video clip can circle the world before anyone has confirmed what it shows. A slogan can be repeated so many times in a matter of hours that it begins to feel self-evident. A manipulated image can provoke millions of reactions before the correction even reaches the people who shared it. That is where content farms enter the picture. Content farms are not interested in truth. They are interested in volume, speed, and emotional reactions. They manufacture memes, clips, sound bites, captions, mashups, and simplified narratives designed to trigger engagement. Their product is not information. Their product is reaction. And reaction is what the algorithm rewards. Once the content exists, amplification takes over. Coordinated accounts repeat the same language. Influencers pick up the same clips. Activists repost material stripped of context. Sometimes automated bots help to push identical talking points at scale. A claim that began with only a small group can quickly appear to represent a broad public consensus. When people encounter the same narrative in 5 places, 10 places, or 20 places, many start to assume it must be true. Repetition creates legitimacy in the minds of people who never stop to ask where the claim actually originated. Foreign influence campaigns have also learned to exploit this environment. A hostile actor does not always need to invent a narrative from scratch. It is often enough to identify an existing social fracture and pour fuel on it. If a society is already divided, if trust is already weak, if people already suspect that institutions lie to them, then all a bad actor has to do is amplify the most inflammatory version of a story. The goal is not necessarily to persuade everyone of one coherent worldview. The goal is to deepen distrust, intensify conflict, and make citizens feel that every issue is proof that their enemies are evil. Once a story is presented that way, many people share it not because they have verified it, but because they feel that sharing it is part of being a good person. In other words, propaganda does not have to make everyone believe the same thing. It only has to make enough people react emotionally and spread it further. Now step back and ask yourself why that matters so much in the context of anti-Semitism. It matters because anti-Semitism has never depended solely on direct hatred. It has often depended on stories. Stories about hidden power. Stories about secret influence. Stories about collective guilt. Stories that take complex events and reduce them to one target. Once those stories are repeated often enough, they become emotionally familiar. And once they become familiar, people stop recognizing them as propaganda and start treating them as common sense. This brings us to history. If we're going to understand why anti-Semitism keeps returning, we have to resist the temptation to begin and end with Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany matters enormously, but if that is the only example people know, they may assume anti-Semitism was a one-time catastrophe tied to one uniquely evil regime. It was not. The pattern existed long before the Nazis, and that is exactly what makes it dangerous. Take medieval Europe. During the Black Death, millions of people were dying. The cause of the plague was not understood. Fear spread everywhere. In that atmosphere, rumors began to circulate that Jewish communities had poisoned wells. The accusation was absurd, but in times of crisis, absurd accusations can become socially useful because they offer frightened people a target. Across parts of Europe, Jewish neighborhoods were attacked and entire communities were massacred. The disease was not caused by the people being blamed, but fear wanted an explanation, and scapegoating supplied one. Now let's fast forward to the Russian Empire in the 19th century. Economic hardship and political instability were intensifying. The state was under strain. Social frustration was high. Again, Jewish communities became targets. Pogroms, which were organized or tolerated waves of anti-Jewish violence, swept through parts of the empire. Homes were destroyed. Families were attacked. Communities were terrorized. Once again, highly complex political and economic forces were simplified into a story that directed public rage toward a minority with limited power to defend itself. Then, of course, we reach Nazi Germany, where anti-Semitism was industrialized into a total worldview. Jews were blamed for economic collapse, cultural decline, political subversion, military betrayal, and almost any form of instability the region wished to explain. That propaganda was not random, it was systematic. Posters, speeches, schools, films, newspapers, and laws all reinforced the same false message until prejudice became policy, and policy became annihilation. Different centuries, different political systems, different crises, yet the mechanism is recognizable every time. Fear rises, complexity overwhelms people, a movement offers a target, a minority is accused of possessing hidden power or hidden guilt, and public anxiety is channeled into a story simple enough to mobilize. At that point, a fair question emerges. Why Jews? Why have Jewish communities so often become the target of this pattern? The first thing to say is that Jews were not the only scapegoat group in history. Societies have blamed many minorities and many vulnerable populations during times of crisis, but Jewish communities occupied places that made them unusually vulnerable to recurring scapegoating. For centuries, Jews lived as minorities, dispersed across many countries. They were inside society, but not always fully accepted as part of the majority identity. Some scholars describe as the outsider within, present, visible, economically active, culturally rooted, but still seen by many as separate. That is a dangerous position when a society begins to look for a group it can portray as both influential and alien. Religious differences also mattered. Jewish communities maintained distinct rituals, communal institutions, calendars, dietary practices, and educational traditions. In healthy societies, differences can be accommodated. In fearful societies, differences can be interpreted as evidence of disloyalty or secrecy. Over time, what should have been ordinary cultural difference was recast by anti-Semites as hidden intention. Legal restrictions deepened the problem. In many periods of European history, Jews were denied access to land ownership and large segments of guilt-based labor. Those exclusions did not keep Jews outside the economy. They pushed them into narrower economic roles. Some entered trade, some entered lending, some worked in professions available to outsiders precisely because they were barred from others. Later, those patterns were turned against them. The very economic roles produced by exclusion were repackaged as proof of sinister influence. This is how stereotypes are born. A legal restriction creates an adaptive response. The adaptive response becomes visible. The visibility becomes resented. The resentment becomes myth. Across centuries, several myths repeated again and again. One myth claimed that Jews controlled money. Another claimed that Jews controlled governments, media, institutions behind the scenes. A third claimed that Jews manipulate countries into fighting wars for Jewish interests. None of these myths are true, but all of them are powerful because they convert complexity into narrative. If people are anxious about debt, a myth about financial control gives them a villain. If people distrust institutions, a myth about hidden influence gives them a villain. If people fear war, a myth about dual loyalty gives them a villain. That matters because these myths do not appear when the world modernizes. They adapt. They reappear in new language. They dress themselves in the vocabulary of the moment. A medieval accusation becomes a modern conspiracy theory. A 19th century stereotype becomes a 21st century meme. A totalitarian lie becomes a viral talking point. And many people aren't noticing that they're recycling very old ideas because the repackaging feels new. This also helps explain why anti-Semitism can appear on opposite political extremes at the same time. On the far right, anti-Semitism often appears through conspiracies about global control, financial manipulation, demographic change, media influence, or cultural corruption. The Jew is cast as a hidden elite undermining the nation from within. On parts of the far left, anti-Semitism can appear differently. Instead of racial nationalism, the language may be anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, or anti-imperialist. But the pattern can still drift towards collective blame, where Jews broadly, rather than specific policies or governments, are cast as uniquely powerful oppressor class. Different ideological vocabularies, same old temptation to simplify the world through one symbolic enemy. And that brings us back to the question of why this is intensifying now. It is intensifying now because we are living in a convergence of several destabilizing conditions all at once. First, geopolitical conflict creates emotionally overwhelming imagery and narratives. When people witness suffering, they want an explanation immediately. That emotional urgency can quickly outpace factual understanding. Second, social media rewards certainty, speed, anger, and moral performance more than careful truth-seeking. Third, many people no longer trust institutions. Definitely not the media. The government is suspect. Universities are indoctrinating any of the other so-called experts. Once trust collapses, alternative narratives become easier to accept, even when those narratives are crude or manipulative. Fourth, foreign actors and domestic extremists alike understand a divided public is easier to radicalize than a stable one. So why now? Because the conditions that historically make scapegoating effective are here again. Fear, distrust, information overload, political polarization, identity conflict, economic anxiety, a sense that the world is unstable and that hidden forces must be to blame. That combination is fertile ground for ancient myths to return in digital form. And why again? Because hatred that offers people a simple story is always tempting when reality becomes too complicated. Anti-Semitism persists not because history failed to warn us, but because human beings remain vulnerable to narratives that satisfy emotion before they satisfy truth. That is why this conversation is not only about Jews. It is about critical thinking. It is about whether we will allow emotion to outrun evidence. It is about whether we can recognize propaganda before it hardens into moral certainty. It is about whether we can tell the difference between legitimate criticism of policies, governments, or military actions, and a much older pattern that shifts from criticism into collective blame. History shows that once a society normalizes those myths, the damage does not stay confined to one minority. The corrosion spreads. Truth weakens, institutions weaken, citizens become easier to manipulate. Public trust collapses, and eventually the very society that tolerated the lie becomes captive to it. So the final question is not simply whether anti-Semitism is rising. It is. The final question is whether we are willing to recognize the pattern while there is still time to interrupt it, because every age imagines it is too advanced to repeat the oldest mistakes, and history keeps proving otherwise.